And once we actually go in and we do that inner work and we get you aligned, we get you in that deep place of self-acceptance, we actually start to heal the attachment style. I find like magic, and it's not magic. It's just there's an actual scientific reason that has to do with your reticular activating system. But without going into all that, let's just call it magic. You naturally start to attract a different, like you start to see the possibilities, right? It's like, right. And this is why so many of the clients that I work with, they're hard on themselves because they're afraid that if they stop being hard on themselves, they're going to go back to being lazy. They're going to go back to not doing the things that they need to do. Right. So they have to constantly be on themselves, like whipping themselves into doing what they need to do. And this kind of like David Goggins energy, right, which can be a very useful energy at times, but I personally don't resonate with it as much because I think it feeds into this narrative of like actually not really accepting yourself as you are and not trusting yourself that you can find the necessary inspiration away from just judging yourself and criticizing yourself and shaming yourself into doing the things that you want to do, or into not doing the things that you don't want to do, like watching porn, smoking weed, right? Liking that, like, and it's a very uncomfortable transition, but once you stick with it and you really just allow yourself to surrender to that process, right? Like eventually you start to really feel into what authentically showing up is, right? And that's something that can't really be taught or explained. That's something you have to feel in your body. It's sort of just like this full body alignment, right? That you just feel and you're like, man, I'm just showing up as myself with no expectations, like completely independent of the good or the bad opinions of other people. And that.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Define Your Purpose. Purpose is the birthplace of ideas. And I am really excited today to welcome a friend of mine who is an amazing relationship coach out of Richmond, Virginia. He helps growth-minded men build incredibly deeply fulfilling relationships. And he's a relationship coach for professionals seeking a real connection. Please welcome Mr. Danny Salinas. Danny, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Karl, and thank you to anybody who's listening. Appreciate you guys having me on.
Awesome. Well, I know you've had some different experiences throughout life that have kind of led you into this want to help people, specifically men, with relationships. So I wonder, did you think you would be doing that when you were younger? How did you get started?
Yeah, definitely not. That's a great question. So I didn't really have that many male role models as I think a lot of men can kind of relate to. And even though, I did have a father, he was a little bit MIA, and then my parents got divorced and he moved out when I was like 11. So I still did learn from him, but I think having like a healthy, integrated masculine leader, somebody who's integrated their masculine and feminine energies, I didn't really have too many of those people in my life. So, and for a long time, I actually wanted to be like, I think I fell into what a lot of guys fall into, wanting to be like better than my father. And there's nothing bad against like wanting to strive to be better, but I was doing it from a place of judgment. And I was judging my father. I was judging, and therefore, without realizing, I was judging myself. I was judging the own masculine energy inside of myself. So along my journey, it took like 2.5 decades for me to really start to integrate my masculine energy and even understand what that meant and develop characteristics more of a like assertiveness and confidence, really an inner confidence that was unshakable, not just an external confidence, because I had that. And so, yeah, like I think along that journey, I saw just how much men needed this work and needed this help. So I decided to focus on specifically helping men because I can identify with that, and I think we need it the most.
Did toxic masculinity influence that? Because it's a lot. It happens a lot in our culture, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so, I think that's an important word. Sometimes I think it can unintentionally invoke shame. So I prefer to
Mm,
just use the word like unhealthy masculinity or immature masculinity because I think that's a little
mm,
bit more um, directly relevant for most men out there. Sure, there is examples of extreme toxic masculinity as well, but yeah, I think definitely like wanting to help other guys find a better balance between between just the traditional sort of powerful and strong uh, uh, demonstrations of masculinity, but also interweaving that and like balancing that out with like the emotional intelligence and the kindness, right, and the compassion. And I definitely think and know that there is space for both, right? But I think we don't have a ton of leadership when it comes to that, or a ton of examples. So, I
mhm.
wanted to be able to help men do that as I myself continue to grow and integrate more of those myself, because I'm definitely not the perfect ideal man.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Well, how did you get going in your coaching business then? Just helping those around you?
Yeah, so I originally actually started as like a health coach, and then
Mm,
as I started working with other business coaches myself who were helping me out, they kind of helped me see that like the theme of my life had been for most of my life had been like relationships, and I had been obsessed with women. I had wanted to learn pickup and dating, and I had tons of different girlfriends and would jump around from girlfriend to girlfriend. And looking back, I was a little bit of like a player, although at the time I probably wouldn't have called myself that, right? And so my coaches were actually encouraging me to do this, even though I didn't really want to become a dating and relationship coach at first. I kind of didn't want to
mm,
step into that role. I was a little bit nervous. I had imposter syndrome about a lot of things. I was still learning to integrate my own masculine energy, but once I did, and once I kind of just stepped into it, it really fit like a glove. I realized that I had a deep level of like intuitive understanding over how to connect with women and how to work on a relationship, and build a relationship, a meaningful one that I just didn't see a lot of other people having. And then
mhm,
on top of that, I also did get certified in integrated attachment theory. And when I learned attachment theory, that's
mm,
when a lot of things really like just took off for me. I was able to put a lot of like the intuition into practical methodologies and into practical words. And then also it gave me the opportunity to go deeper into my own healing. And yeah, that's definitely the combination between just so many years of dating and being like obsessed with women, and then mixed with my own certification of integrated attachment theory, which comes from a woman named Thais Gibson. Those two things combined really allowed me to develop the expertise that I now have on the subject.
wow, that's awesome. Great. So, have you been able to develop kind of a framework when you help clients? Because I mean, relationships can be all over the place and so different.
Definitely, definitely. So, I mean, the cool thing is, as a coach yourself, I'm sure you start to see those patterns, right? And when you're working with your clients,
Mhm.
and patterns start to emerge, right? And so, one of those patterns that I've noticed, if I had to boil it all down to just one thing, it'd really be just a lack of radical self acceptance. I think is what I see most often in the guys that I work with,
Mm,
that is preventing them from being able to attract the partner that they want and then develop that relationship, right? And so for me, I personally like to focus there, right? I want to get the foundation right, and then from there we can build all the other stuff, because I think a lot of guys want to develop the skills and the communication and the techniques, and it's like, tell me what to say, tell me what to do, when really, if that's all being built on top of a faulty foundation, right, which in this case is a lack of radical self-acceptance, then ultimately it's not really going to work. And even if it does work, it's not ultimately going to be fulfilling, right? And that's what happened to me, is that even despite all my success, and I was like, dating tons of beautiful women, I even dated this really hot stripper for a while, and I thought that like everything was like amazing. I was like, I've reached the pinnacle of what I've been trying to reach, and it was like this fantasy. But then in practice, like I was deeply unfulfilled, and I was still had my insecure attachment style I hadn't worked through yet. So that relationship didn't end up lasting or being fulfilling during the time that I was there. Right. And so my goal is to get to the root of it. And I don't like to just work on symptoms, right? On surface level solutions. I want to get to the root of it. And the root of it for the majority of the men that I've worked with and that I see is a lack of self acceptance. And when we can get them to accept themselves in such a radical, deeply, deeply accepting way, right? That's what it opens up the space for them to show up as their truly authentic selves and even understand what that means, right? Because you can't just be your authentic self just naturally. Like if I just tell you to be yourself, you're just going to be the person that you're used to being, right? That's not your authentic self. Like you have to actually work to integrate your authentic self and different pieces of that have been lost, that have been repressed, that have been neglected, right? That have been exiled, and integrating those parts back into your character. And that process is the process of self-acceptance. And once you integrate all those parts that you've lost, right, over your upbringing due to trauma and limiting beliefs, once you do that, that's the process of radical self-acceptance. And when you get there, then really that's the beginning point. And at that point, it's a lot easier. Like at that point, I don't have to do much because the person, my client, has already come to such a deep level of understanding over themselves and such a deep level of acceptance over themselves that from there, if I tell them, okay, now try this with a partner or whatever, then it becomes so much easier. So I hope that answered the question.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, I wonder why that's such a problem today for so many. The self acceptance. I mean, do you think it's the modern culture, or it seems to happen across different societies, right? Different cultures, doesn't it?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think that the parenting is a big part of that. Also, the culture as well, right? Especially now with technology. I think comparison is just like a pandemic, right? Like we're all just comparing ourselves, including me. I'm not exempt from this, right? Like if I get on Instagram or I get on Facebook or whatever, and I start seeing all these coaches that are doing the work that I'm doing, but they're so much further ahead, right? And they're like 100K followers or more, right? 1 million. And it can feel like, man, like I'm just not doing enough, right? And I think that's the thing that's connected to this radical or lack of self-acceptance rather, is this wound, this core wound, this limiting belief of I am not enough, right? I'm not good enough. And this is especially the case for high achiever types, right? And so this is the type of client that I work with are these high achievers. And so I help them to see that like just how much of their drive, right? Just how much of their motivation is being driven by this lack of self-acceptance and this constant need to try to prove themselves, right? That's what happened to me, right? Like I was a musician for a long time. I pursued it for like a decade and wanted to be this like famous musician. And I was like touring India and I was like getting girls and stuff, right? And I was living this rock star life, playing lead guitar but again, it comes back to the same thing. It's like I didn't accept myself. So I was doing all those things to try to get this external validation, which never filled the void, right? And I mean, it never did. So
yeah, I feel like so many people are stuck in that, and they don't even know what it is really. It's kind of like you get kind of backed into that habitually almost.
absolutely. Yeah. And it's not the most comfortable thing to face, right? You might have an awareness over it and be like, yeah, maybe I don't actually fully accept myself. But then we don't actually stop to really let that land, because if we did, it would dismantle everything. We'd start to have to question the reason we're doing anything, right? And that's a very uncomfortable thing to experience, but it's necessary, right? It's almost like an ego dissolution that needs to happen because we're so used to wearing these masks, right? Like I was a people pleaser for a long time in my life, right? And this is very tied to this high achiever type of mentality as well. The people pleaser, high achiever archetype, right? That's a very common thing. And that's a very common client archetype that I work with, right? And it's like the process of taking off that mask that has been so comfortable to wear, the one that people pleases, right?
Mhm.
And it gives us a sense of like control over the environment, and it gives us a
Yeah.
sense of control over the people that we're engaging with. But
Mhm.
when you start to take that off, all of a sudden things become really strange because you're not sure who you really are, and everything feels fake. You're starting
Mhm.
to question everything. Is this authentic? Am I showing up authentically, right? Or am I
Yeah.
faking that? Like, and it's a very
Right.
uncomfortable transition, but once you stick with it and you really just allow yourself to surrender to that process, right? Like eventually you start to really feel into what authentically showing up is, right? And that's something that can't really be taught or explained. That's something you have to feel in your body. It's
Mhm.
sort of just like this full body alignment, right? That you just
Yeah.
feel, and you're like, man, I'm just showing up as myself with no expectations, like completely independent of the good or the bad opinions of other people. And that is like
Yeah.
true freedom.
Yeah. I think it's something that we're taught too, that when you go to school and you're kind of taught to be that way.
Absolutely.
To try to gain approval. You're taught that from a very young age to do, almost out of necessity, to do what your parents and teachers tell you to, and it just becomes ingrained, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Carl. And like, like we were having conversations about this before, different kinds of emotions that don't get that basically get like shamed, right? Whether
Mhm.
explicitly or implicitly, just because you're not getting a good response, right? No one says maybe like don't show anger. Like no one's telling you necessarily that. I mean, some people could, right? But your parents could, but it's most oftentimes like it just doesn't get a good response, right? Or it gets no response at all, which is even worse, right? Like neglect. And so those emotions that we weren't allowed to really feel or that weren't accepted, weren't embraced, right? Then of course we
Mhm.
just learn by modeling. We're like, okay, well, we're not supposed to show those emotions, right? And oftentimes it is anger, right? Like because again, it was kind of like the same thing for me. It was like I
Mhm.
didn't want to be like my dad, and my dad did have moments where he would explode with anger, but it was because he would repress it all the time, right? So I wanted to be the good boy to save my mom, right? And so then that develops that what you're talking about, that people pleasing tendency.
Right. Yeah. And stuff gets ingrained kind of deeply too. It's like when you're an adult, it's been so practiced in that you almost don't remember where it came from, and you're just acting this way out of out of nowhere.
Right. Exactly. And this is where, like coaches like me or other coaches that do this kind of reprogramming work is where we can step in and help, right? Because to me,
Mhm.
like everything we're talking about right now, like to all the audience listening, this is great. I mean, a lot of you guys are probably just like nodding your head along, like, yep, yep, I already know that. I already know that. So, like, what actually gets us to change, right? Because all the awareness in the world
Mhm.
isn't enough, right? It's a
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
first step, but it actually can lead to more frustration because you
Mhm.
become aware of these things and then you're like, okay, but then how do I change them, right? You still
Yeah.
can't change them. It feels like you're aware of it, but now you can't just blame it on ignorance. You can't just chalk it up to not knowing or to naivety. Now you know. And so then it's even harder because then it's kind of like you feel maybe some guilt that you can't change, right? And
Yeah.
that's where the inner critic starts to come in, and the self-criticism and the self-judgment, right? Like I should be able to do this, I should be doing this. Like I always really try to tell my clients to catch themselves anytime they're saying the word should at all to themselves, right? Because that's a
Mhm.
very good indicator that the critic is online, right? And even if you can get yourself to do something by shaming yourself into doing it, or by judging yourself, by criticizing yourself into doing it, like you might still get the reward, the external result, which is like better discipline or whatever, but ultimately you're tarnishing your self-esteem, right? Because
Mhm.
that part of you deep inside wants to be trusted, that to be able to do what you need to do without the shaming, right? But and this is
Yeah.
why so many of the clients that I work with, they're hard on themselves because they're afraid that if they stop being hard on themselves, they're going to go back to being lazy. They're going to go back to not doing the things that they need to do, right? So they
Mhm.
have to constantly be on themselves, like whipping themselves into doing what they need to do. and this kind of like David Goggins energy, right? Which can be a very useful energy at times, but I personally don't resonate with it as much because I think it feeds into this narrative of like actually not really accepting yourself as you are and not trusting yourself that you can find the necessary inspiration away from just judging yourself and criticizing yourself and shaming yourself into doing the things that you want to do, or into not doing the things that you don't want to do, like watching porn, smoking weed, right? Like those are big with some of my clients, right? And with a lot of us, it's like, and we all feel like really bad after we do it, right? And so, yeah, I don't mean to ramble. It's just I get passionate about this, and I obviously want to help. So,
yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting stuff to think about.
totally.
So it seems kind of like a roundabout way, like the karate instructor teaching you wax on or something. Do you learn this inner Zen stuff, and then your clients are just amazed with the change that comes over them, and the women flock to them, or how does that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the interesting thing is like what I like about this work is, well, so there's, okay, so here's the thing that anybody listening needs to understand, right? Is that there's two different skill sets that I really help my clients work with, and I think there's two different skill sets that we all need to be able to have some mastery over. So the first is like emotional processing, right? Like if you don't know how to process your emotions, you're going to be run by them. Like that's just period. Or you're going to suppress them, right? And then eventually be run by them because obviously when you suppress it, it's eventually going to explode. In either case, you don't have mastery, right? I think a lot of people, like maybe, I would include my dad in this a little bit, is like he has a lot of self-restraint, a lot of self-control, but it's not because he's necessarily processing his emotions. It's because more so he's like stuffing them down, right? And so even if he's able to do that consistently and sustainably, which it's not sustainable, but even if he was, he's missing out on the wisdom of the emotion, because every emotion that comes up there's some wisdom, there's some information, there's a message that it's up to you to decode. And when you decode that message, then you actually gain insight, right? And then you know what to do. Then you can act, right? And you don't have to do the thing that the emotion is telling you to do, but you just need to listen to it. Once you have the information, you're the general, you get to decide what you want to do. But it'd be the same as like ignoring your advisors and be like, no, I don't want to hear what you have to say because I'm afraid that if I listen, I'm going to do what you say. But that's not how a general rules, right? The general wants to hear the king wants to hear all of the advisors, and then he makes the decision. It's the same way with our emotions, right? We want to be able to have access and process them so that we can understand what the message is and then be better prepared to act in whatever way we deem necessary. Okay, so we have that skill of emotional processing. Then we have the skill of reprogramming, right? So the reprogramming skill, that's what's actually getting down to the core wounds, which are the limiting beliefs, right? And I'll just name a few of them, like that I am not good enough, I am bad, I am unworthy, I will be rejected, right? These are limiting beliefs that we are holding on to that a lot of guys struggle, especially when they're wanting to approach a woman or in a relationship, right? It's like they're like, if I don't do everything my girlfriend is asking of me, then I'm bad, right? Or if I approach this girl and I get rejected, then I will feel rejected. I will feel not good enough. I will feel unworthy. Or maybe they're like, I don't want to creep this girl out, so I'm not going to approach at all, right? Well, there's the I am bad core wound coming up, right? So behind all of our behaviors, there's these core wounds that are happening. And so we need to reprogram those. So those are the two skills, right? One is the processing of the emotions and of the triggers, because we get triggered, we need to process that emotion. But even if you became an expert at processing your emotions, well, you're not actually dealing with the trigger, right? That's what we need the reprogramming for. Once you reprogram, that's when you can actually uproot the trigger. So I equate this to like snipping the weeds, the leaves off of a weed, right? Like you can snip the leaves and that's like processing your emotions, but reprogramming is like actually grabbing the root and taking it out completely. And you need both, absolutely need both of these skill sets. So back to your question, right? Like what I help my clients do and what gives them like immediate relief is teaching them how to emotionally process, because most guys do not have that skill set to the degree that I believe they need it. Even if you think you do, you might be okay at it, or you might be okay with certain emotions, but then not okay with certain other emotions, right? And that's what's tricky. It's like, it's not just that you're good or bad at it. It's like, you might be okay. Maybe sadness was okay for you and your family. And so when you're sad, you can express that and embrace it, but anger wasn't, right? So then you might suck at processing anger, but be really good at processing sadness, or vice versa. Or maybe with both emotions are not safe for you. It all is dependent on your custom upbringing, right? So when I help my clients be able to process their emotions, they start to feel immediate relief, but it doesn't mean they necessarily change right away, right? For that, we need to do the reprogramming work. But once we actually start doing the reprogramming work, right? And there's multiple ways to do that. There's different techniques for different people and their flavor that they like, right? Once they start to do that, they actually start to feel different in their bodies, right? That's what I'm all about. It's like, because all of this is like mental masturbation until it actually feels different in your body, right? So when you start to do these reprogramming work along with emotional processing, these two things work in tandem. They create a different emotional experience within your body. And the first place that I like to get my clients to, like I was saying, is radical self-acceptance. So how can you know that you radically self-accept yourself? Well, you're only going to be able to do that in the face of a really challenging kind of worst case scenario, right? Otherwise, if everything was perfect, like, of course you're going to accept yourself, right? Like, it's like you have all this external validation. Can you accept yourself though, when you don't have that? And in fact, can you take it even a step further? Can you accept yourself in the face of a rejection, right? Especially from like a woman. So what I like to help my clients with is to get to even that place, right? Where they can feel so much confidence and self-assuredness, even in the face of a rejection. When they can do that, right? Then what else do you have left to fear? You already processed like the most tricky thing, right? Which is like that feeling of embarrassment, that feeling of inadequacy that comes up in the face of a rejection. Well, if you've already sat with that, you've already processed it, and you already trust yourself to be able to handle it, what more do you have to fear? Right. From that space, finally, to answer your question with the final piece of this, is like, from that space, I'm much less interested in in the techniques and the dating stuff, because the client just doesn't really need it anymore, because they've already gotten the most important thing. From there, sure, I'm like, if you need to know a little texting game here, if you want to learn a little pickup thing here, a cold approach ice breaking line here, sure, that's all like little frosting, and we can, sprinkles on the cake, but we've already worked on the core, on the base.
Right. Awesome. That's great. So do you go a step further then? Do you help set up dates for your clients, or how, what do your plans look like then, for when the average client signs on?
The plans, you said, like, how do I actually? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm personally not as interested in like trying to get my clients like to like set up dates for them or things like that, right? Like, I think that most guys can find some kind of date, right? Like, if they want to. It's just like, here's the thing, is that like, and maybe this is a good time to talk about attachment styles, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts here, and I don't want to overwhelm the audience either with all of this like reprogramming and emotional processing. But these things, it took me a while to kind of figure this out. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, but I also don't want to leave out important stuff that is definitely necessary. So understanding your attachment style is super critical, right? Because now a lot of relationship coaches focus on attachment style, but a lot of dating coaches don't. And I think that's a huge mistake, right? Because a lot, I only presume that the reason they don't focus on attachment styles is because they're like, well, why would I need that? That's only for when I'm in a relationship, right? Because attachment styles kind of determines the way you show up in a relationship. But here's the thing that took me a while to understand, is that actually your attachment style dictates the kind of partners that you are attracting, right? Because your attachment style is rooted most of the time in the trauma, in those limiting beliefs, right? That we picked up in that inauthentic self. And so what a lot of guys don't realize is like, sometimes guys have this thing about like, I can't find a girl. I'm not attracting partners. Maybe I need to move to a different city where there's more people or whatever. Right. And okay, sometimes that's true. I'm not going to hold that against anybody, but most of the time, the thing that I see is really just that there's these disempowering limiting beliefs that is actually creating your reality, right? Like it's actually dictating to you what you think you're seeing, and you think you have an accurate view of what's in your community or the women or whatever the things and the opportunities available to you, but actually you don't. And once we actually go in and we do that inner work, and we get you aligned, we get you in that deep place of self-acceptance, we actually start to heal the attachment style. I find like magic, and it's not magic. It's just there's an actual scientific reason that has to do with your reticular activating system. But without going into all that, let's just call it magic. You naturally start to attract a different, like you start to see the possibilities, right? It's like when you buy a car, right? Like let's say you get a white Jeep, and then you start to see white Jeeps everywhere. It's like those white Jeeps were already there. You just didn't see it because you weren't focused on it. In a similar way, once we do the reprogramming work, all of a sudden, like the opportunities start showing themselves. And more importantly, you're able to now filter the partners that are not compatible, the partners that are just going to be fueling the dysfunctional patterns that you're used to. You're going to be able to weed those out. You're going to be an expert at identifying the red flags, and then allowing the new kind of relationship dynamic to enter. And a lot of that process can be tricky because you're so used to this dysfunctional pattern. And you may say, I want a different pattern, but the truth is like your nervous system doesn't, because it's different and it's unique. And there's a whole other set of problems and challenges there. So you need to become comfortable with accepting that new kind of relationship dynamic, that new kind of partner, and then start to feel and normalize the sense of ease in your body. And that can be very tricky. And this is the point where now self-sabotage becomes the most tempting, because now let's say you've actually worked through, you're attracted a better partner, but now it almost feels too good to be true. And if you have an I am unworthy core wound, which a lot of guys do as well, now you'll start to self-sabotage it because you're like, no, this is too good. Like and your subconscious is begging to reenact the same old patterns because it's so used to that. Right. So it's tricky business. I personally don't. So to answer your question in short here, I personally don't like to focus on a lot of the surface level techniques and tactics and stuff, because I'm a true believer, and I've seen it time and time again, that when you get the core right, the rest of it usually takes care of itself pretty quickly after that.
Wow, awesome. That's great. It sounds like you've been able to help a lot of guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, I've been able to help myself, I think above all, like I've been able to help
Yeah,
myself. And yes,
awesome.
I've also been able to help other guys for sure. But the thing is, like, the reason I'm so passionate about focusing on the inner stuff more so than the outer game, right? The inner game prioritizing over the outer game, is because I had outer game. Like I had mad outer game. I was able to kind of flirt and connect with nearly any woman that I wanted to, right? A lot of guys would kill for that kind of power, and I had it, right? But the problem was that, like, it's good for like a little bit as you're like, oh, cool, I can get girls. But my life was anything but peaceful. It was just full of drama. I was getting myself into really dumb situations that by like hooking up with a certain girl that wasn't appropriate because of the friend group, but I didn't care about that stuff. I just cared about myself at the time. And or like I just cared about what other people were thinking about me, right? So like this dating the stripper, we weren't the most compatible, but I ignored that. I ignored all of that because I was like, here's an opportunity to date like a perfect 10 looking stripper that all these guys and all these girls are going to look at me and validate me because of it. That's all I cared about. And so because I was prioritizing the wrong things, right? The outer game, the outer stuff, like I just kept over and over and over again, kept attracting these relationships where I was not fulfilled at all. And in fact, a lot of it was just reaffirming my self identity at the time, which was that like I was a fuck boy. I'm sorry to put the cuss, but I didn't, like I was like this player dude. I couldn't make a relationship work. I didn't even want a relationship to work. I would argue. I would oftentimes get really angry and like blow up at my partners and say things like be even verbally abusive. Like there's a lot of regret that I had because of that stuff. And it was ultimately those experiences that got me to be like, finally just, okay, like why do I keep doing this? Like, this isn't the kind of man that I know that I am. It's not the kind of man that I want to be. So why do I keep getting myself? It seems like in every other area of my life, I was this really kind, nice person. But in my relationships in particular, they just had a way of triggering the hell out of me. And I was like, why is this happening?
Mm.
So I had to figure it out.
Mm.
And that's when I went into learning about attachment styles. And that's when I
Okay.
started to heal myself. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. So have you had any other great success stories with clients that come to mind? I mean, that's such a great, your own story is a great success story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it depends on, yeah, I'll share two to kind of illustrate, I guess, a different situation. So, one, I had this client who was a little bit younger, and he's kind of like me. He just wanted to learn how to cold approach, and not because he wanted to be able to just attract any partner he wanted, although that is a part of it. But he knew that he wanted that radical level of self-acceptance, right? And he knew that by cold approaching, he would be forced to develop that. So it was really tricky at the beginning because he was feeling like he didn't want to creep them out, right? The I am bad core wound was coming up. The I will be rejected core wound was coming up. He was feeling like he wasn't fundamentally worthy of those women. So we had to go and address all of these core wounds, all these limiting beliefs, and reprogram them.
Wow.
And in the course, over the course of like 6 months, yeah, so on top of that, he came to me at a time where he was like, he just experienced a deep trauma in his life that really tarnished his self-esteem. So not only was he struggling with this, but he was actually negative, like at a deficit in self-esteem. He was like in a really, really vulnerable place.
Mm.
And in
Wow.
about 6 months, we got him to a place now where he's like approaching, he can approach any girl he wants now. And it's amazing. He told me, he's just like, dude, he's like, I've never felt so much freedom in my life. He's like, it doesn't even matter if the approach is good or not. That's the thing. Like, I'm not saying he's going and approaching women and every single time he's getting their numbers and landing dates and scoring. Like, no, he gets rejected frequently, just like I did when I cold approached, just like every guy does, because that rejection, as anybody who's in sales, right, and as a business coach, that like rejection is part of the process, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, we can do that in sales, but then when it comes to like the feminine energy, right, a woman, all of a sudden, like, the rejection is like 10 times worse. I mean,
Mm.
it's like that. There,
Mhm.
I think there can't be anything more extreme in this life for a man than to get rejected by a beautiful woman. Like that, like that's a test of your true character. If you can sit with that and still love yourself, like,
Mm.
that's a test of your true character. And that's what he wanted, and that's what he has now. And so at this point, like, I'm not even helping him try to get a girlfriend, because he doesn't care anymore. He's like, I
Mm.
know it'll come. He's like, I'm just happy that you were able to help me get to this place, right? And so that's one of my client success stories. Another one would be like, I had a client that was in a relationship that he wasn't happy in, right? Like, and like literally a week into working together, his girlfriend broke up with him, right? It was just like bad timing, because I was going to help him actually improve his relationship, but like a week into
Mm.
working, like, she just broke up with him. And I helped, and like, he was experiencing so much heartbreak, so many emotions,
Mm.
anger and sadness. Like, he would oscillate between basically being super angry at his ex, and like, and on our calls he would be getting really upset and angry, and then he would, in a moment, he would switch and he'd get really sad, and he'd start to cry and say how much he missed her and how much he wanted her back, and then he would switch again and get angry. And so I helped him first off with the emotional processing of that, the post
Mm.
breakup. And then he, like, with my accountability, right, he consciously stayed off the dating apps and did not date for about like 3 months, because he needed that time to heal, right? And it was really tricky for him because he was used to just rebounding, right? And that was my pattern
Mm.
too, right? And I think a lot of guys, we do that because we don't want to sit with those emotions, but that's where the juice is, and that's the opportunity to actually heal, and you can accelerate your
Mm.
growth if you take advantage of that. And so fortunately, he hired me like literally during his breakup, so we just focused on that. 3 months later, he gets back onto the dating apps once he's like healed and he's ready to go, and he meets a partner. He meets the best partner that he's ever met in his life. Like, to this point, he was shocked. I remember as he was talking to me, he was like, dude, like, I didn't even know this was possible, because all he's ever known was drama. All he's ever known
Mm.
was fighting. All he's ever known was being like kind of belittled and being a pushover in his relationships. He didn't have good boundaries, right? And
Mm.
all of a sudden now he's showing up in this relationship with healthy boundaries, prioritizing himself and his needs, right? And being able to have a partner that he can communicate openly and honestly about, that responds well to him. So that was a huge
Yeah.
success story. Like, yeah, it was just amazing. And I didn't have to work on, I didn't have to help him at all with the attracting a partner thing. Like, he did all the work. He was really diligent. And then again, like I said, magic, somebody comes into your life, right? Because the thing is, the way the universe operates, and I think if anybody really pays attention, I feel like we can kind of pick up on this pattern, is like the universe is going to give you these situations, the same situation, until you finally like level up, right? Until you break through, you solve that lesson, you learn that lesson, and then the universe gives you like a level up, right? It's like literally like a
Mm.
video game, right? You just have to keep playing the same level until you finally beat that boss, and then you level up. And so it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, it's not that like a lack of women or opportunities that is causing guys to not be able to have those opportunities. It really is just that they get stuck and they don't know what they need to do in order to beat this boss, and I just help them beat the boss. Then they level up, they go to the next level, and all of a sudden on the next level, it's just like, oh, look at all these opportunities because they've
Right.
learned the lesson that they needed to.
Mm. That's great. Yeah. And those things were always there the whole time. That the people just don't see it until they change the mindset, right?
Exactly. They don't see it, or here's the deeper thing is like you actually don't like it. You don't want it. And this
Mm.
is what's so interesting
Yeah.
that I was so shocking to me, is that the women that actually were healed, the secure women in my life that were in my life when I was insecure, I wasn't as attracted to them. Right? That's what
Mm.
like blows my mind now, is thinking back on that
Mm.
time. I literally wasn't as attracted to them. I was way more attracted to the women that were insecure, that had problems, and that were going to be the reciprocal end of that dysfunctional relationship dynamic I was so used to. In other words, I was
Mm.
looking for somebody to trauma bond. And the women that weren't going to play that game, they just didn't even register on my radar. It was just like they were there,
Mm.
and I was just like, "Oh, okay, yeah, yeah." What, it's like an NPC or something. I'm like, "Yeah," but it wasn't. I
Mm.
wasn't like deeply attracted to them. But once I started to heal, and I started to
Mm.
see my own coping mechanisms and my own relationship dynamics for what they were, and I saw the temptation to be with these women that I knew were going to just be a repeat of all those dysfunctional relationships in the past. Once I was there and I had that awareness, and I was consciously choosing a different way, I started to see like, wow, like I felt my own reluctance to be with those healthy, secure women. And I had to train
Wow.
myself and teach myself that, like, no, this is the new norm. This is what you actually want. And then I started to normalize it to the point where, like, finally, after a long time, now I can't stand to be around like an insecure type of woman that, like, it's not that I can't stand to be around her. It's that, like, I would never entertain being sexual romantic with her, because I know that
Mhm.
it would just come up, it would just like pull out the stuff that I've worked so hard to to heal. It would start to like poke at those wounds again, right? So now I avoid those women like the plague because I've done too much work to want to be putting myself in that situation again. So anyways, back to your point, the thing is, either you don't see it or you see it but you actually don't really want it on a subconscious level.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I I think what made you realize that at the time? I mean, was that the coach that you were working with at the time?
The biggest thing was that stripper I was telling you that I was dating.
Mm.
Like, that was really the final straw for me,
Mm.
because like I think up until that point I had been lying to myself, and I'd been telling myself this story that like the reason my relationships weren't working was because of the woman, and I was like, she wasn't the right woman, and like I could probably find somebody more attractive and more compatible and more whatever. But when I was dating the stripper, like, she was the pinnacle. There was like, she was the most physically attractive I've ever been with. Like, there was nothing I could complain about physically. She loved sex. Like, she wanted to have it all the time. Like, it was just she was actually like a pretty kind person too. Like, she would cook me dinner and stuff. Like, I'm not
Mm.
saying she was a horrible person or anything like that, but she still had an insecure attachment style. And more importantly, I still had an insecure attachment style. So like when that relationship like kind of blew up, because it ended in a very like verbally abusive like argument and fight where I was like saying things to her that I regret, and she was like dissociating. She just dissociated completely. And then like a week later, or a couple days later, she basically just like said we should break up and stuff. And I honestly agreed. And because I was just like, like, you can't keep doing this. Anyways, I became disillusioned in that moment. That was the moment that I finally was like, it's not about the girl. Like I kept telling myself, it's about the girl. Like that's why I can't commit. That's why I can't make the relationship work. And at that moment I was like, I had the fantasy on a silver platter and I still couldn't make it work. So now there was nowhere else to turn. Like, what was I going to say from there? No, she needs to be like an 11 out of 10 now. Right. Like, so the lie that I was telling myself just went up in smokes. And that's when I was like, okay, it's actually me. And that was hard to accept. And then I had to do the digging and the learning about like why that was the case. Why was it me? Right. And then from then on, that's when like all of a sudden there was a flip, there was a switch. Like that's one of those leveling up moments where from then on, the kind of women that I dated, even if we weren't super compatible, were just so much more communicative, so much more emotionally intelligent, so much more secure than any of the women I had dated before that. And it was just because I had done a certain level of healing and I was no longer willing to tolerate those kind of relationships or willing to tolerate the way that I was showing up in those relationships. So even though I dated women after that and the relationships didn't necessarily last or work out, they were still beautiful relationships, and we ended them with a lot of beauty and a lot of consciousness, and we're still friends now, which is something that I couldn't say for all the relationships before. Right. So that was basically the turning point for me.
Wow. Awesome. That's powerful. So where's the best place to get a hold of you now if people are looking to have a conversation and have a turning point like that and take things to the next level?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So right now I have a very simple offer. And this offer is basically the reason I have this offer, and which I'll tell you in a second, is just because like I also, apart from being a relationship coach, I also am a men's work facilitator. So I run a men's circle in person, and the offer is basically a free virtual men's circle that I run online. And the reason is because like so much of one of those patterns, remember we were talking about the patterns that emerge when you're coaching clients. Like one of those patterns is like, there's usually a degree of isolation that I feel in my clients, right? They just, either they're working from home all day, stuck behind a computer, and they don't get much time to socialize, or they just don't really have a ton of friends that they feel that they can be super vulnerable and open and honest with. So, I know that the first step, like before even trying to work on any of this stuff, is just connecting with other like-minded guys and feeling like you have a sense of camaraderie, right? Because if you don't have that, even if you got the relationship of your dreams, but you don't have a support system of other men that can hold you accountable, that can help to hear you, to see you, to support you, like that relationship is not going to last very long, right? Like, and so I'm a very holistic thinker about all this. Like I market myself as a relationship coach, but really what I care about and what I do is so much deeper than that. The relationship piece is just one little piece. So anyways, all that to say is that the best place to find me would be on thedannysalinas.com. That's THE, the Danny, DANNY, and then Salinas is SALINAS, thedannysalinas.com. And right there, right as soon as you get on the homepage, there's a button to join my free virtual men's circle, and you can add it to your calendar. And it gives you an opportunity just to come and check it out and be able to see like the kind of work that I do with clients and get a taste for what it feels like to work with me before having to invest anything. Right. And then from there, of course, if you want to take it further and get one-on-one coaching or whatever, then you can just reach out to me and we can talk about it. So yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn and Instagram. That's, if you want to shoot me a message on LinkedIn at Danny Salinas or Instagram at the Danny Salinas, it's all the same, spelled the same and everything. So I'd be happy to talk.
Awesome. Great. So what is your typical coaching engagement like? Do you have an amount of time that you work with your clients, or what's
Yeah.
it like when someone signs on?
Definitely. So I personally, again, like I don't like surface level solutions. I don't like a lot of like fluff. Like I really like to get to the core of things. And along with that is like, a lot of people have 3-month coaching programs, and that's great. I mean, I was doing that too. But like, how much transformation can you really do in 3 months, right? Like, I'm more into like long term sustainable um, growth, right? So
Yes.
what I like to do is I actually like to work on a monthly basis. So it's
Mm,
just like, so you just pay for a month of
mhm.
coaching, and then that's it. And then you can, so
Yeah.
after a month, you can
Nice.
stop working with me or you can continue. I typically recommend to work for at least 3 to 6 months together, right? Because that's the amount of time it really takes to correct a lot of these deeply ingrained beliefs, right? And to learn how to process emotions. I mean, it all depends. Everybody's different, right? So it might take you less time or whatever, but 3 to 6 months is typically the time frame that I like to work with my clients. And I just like to do this monthly thing. So you can just decide after a month if you're like, I'm not feeling this, it's not really my style, then okay, then you didn't waste money on a 3 month coaching program. But if you do want to continue,
Yeah.
then you just have that I just find it's a lot more flexible for my clients.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds good. Excellent. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up today that you had in mind that you wanted to mention?
Well, I mean, just thank you, man. I appreciate you having me on. This is
Sure.
I could talk
Yeah.
about I could just keep talking and talking about things, but I want it to be relevant and useful. I think all I'll say is just simply that, like, if you're struggling, if anybody who's listening to this is struggling with their relationships, right? Like, just know that, like, if you might be, because I've been there, and I know that you can get disheartened, and you don't, and
Mm,
sometimes it's like you don't want to try again, and you don't want to play all these games, and and I'll just say that, like, I don't think a lot of us get a good, healthy model of what a healthy relationship looks like. And that's a
right.
huge disservice to us, because
Mm,
then we're sort of left to go throughout life, like trying to attract this thing that we have no idea what it looks like. Right. All we have
mhm,
is our
mhm,
experiences, which usually are pretty negative with relationships. And then also, like, our parents or other people. But even if a even if our parents stay together, which mine didn't, they divorced, but even if they did stay together, like my grandparents, for example, my grandparents are not happy. They've been together for like over 4 decades, but they're not happy together. That's not
mm,
a healthy relationship that I want to model my own relationship after. So
right.
all that to say is that just recognize that because you don't have a model, sometimes it can be really tricky. But just know from somebody
Mm,
that now has done the work to create a healthy relationship with my partner, and having the most beautiful relationship that I've ever had in my life, with the most amount of ease, the most amount of peace, the most amount of transparent communication and emotional regulation. Like, it's just amazing. And so I want to share
oh,
that because it definitely does exist. You can
mm,
definitely attract that into your life, right? With the right tools and doing the right inner work.
mm.
And you're worthy of it. So I just want to say that I'll leave it there.
That's great. Awesome. I love it. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about all this stuff with me today, Danny. Um, I like to say at the end of every show, when we walk with purpose, we collide with destiny.
Love it, man. When we walk with purpose, we collide with
Yeah,
destiny. There we go.
that's it.
Boom. Perfect way to end
So
it.
maybe you were meant to hear this if you're listening, and maybe this is all meant to be. So
Thank you so much, Karl, for having me on here, and the listeners for taking the time to
yeah,
listen. And I hope
yeah,
you guys both have a beautiful day.
yeah. Thank you. Take care.
Take